Hello and welcome to One Iconic Beer. I'm Jeff Allworth, journalist and the author of books like The Beer Bible and The Secrets of Master Brewers, and I'll be your host as we trace the history, culture, and impact of the world's most influential beers. But first, a word about the important partners who make this podcast possible.
All right, brewers, quick question. Have you ever brewed the same beer twice and somehow got two different results? Your haze drops out, sulfur pops up, and that quick lager isn't quick anymore. That's where Escarpment Labs comes in. They've seen this firsthand at top breweries across Canada and the United States. Escarpment helps you choose the right yeast. They help you dial in your process so your beer stays consistent, batch after batch. Escarpment yeast now ships in the United States with priority alert shipping. And for free brewing knowledge, subscribe to the Escarpment Labs podcast and YouTube channel. Go to escarpmentlabs.com to find out more.
All About Beer receives underwriting support from the Hopleaf Bar, the prize of Chicago's beer scene. Publican Michael Roper and his staff understand the importance of independent journalism in the beer space, and their support helps fund original work. Learn how you can affordably support journalists by visiting allaboutbeer.com/support. And thanks again to Michael and the Hopleaf Bar.
What we think of as wit beer today is a recent reinvention of an older, wilder style of beer. This old Belgian wheat ale was reborn when one of the workers at the last brewery in Hoegaarden, Belgium, Pierre Celis, recreated the extinct style with a modern recipe. Growing in popularity, the local favorite escaped Belgium, first as an export, and then as a beer recreated in breweries around the world. Wit beer enjoyed a second life in the United States, where Celis founded his own brewery in 1992, later inspiring American brewers. Notably, Rob Tod was one of those brewers. He was working at Vermont's Otter Creek Brewing when he tasted a Celis White and was so inspired he would go on to start his own brewery. For its first year, the Portland, Maine-based Allagash made only one beer, Allagash White, and it's still the brewery's flagship. More than that, with its distinctive dry, complex palate, it has become the most awarded wit beer in the world. Today, we're going to recount the story of wit beer, where it came from, and how it evolved. We'll be hearing from Stan Hieronymus, who wrote the 2010 book Brewing With Wheat, and Rob Tod, founder of Allagash Brewing. 60 years after Belgium's famous white ale came back from the dead, Allagash has emerged as the one true heir to the wit beer lineage. In our maiden episode of the podcast, we'll learn how Allagash White has become one iconic beer. Can you start by distinguishing between the dark barley beers and the white or wheat beers they brewed in Belgium back in the 19th century?
The obvious answer is the white beers were whiter. A reason they were whiter is because quite often they used either unmalted grains or wind malted grains, so they weren't kilned. So if you look at the back half of the 19th century in a beer like at the time, the beer de Hoegaarden, which ends up being called Hoegaarden, it's made with more than half the grist is barley. That's a wind malted barley. So those appeared much whiter. They're cloudier. They were served generally really young, and they were sour.
In your excellent book, Brewing with Wheat, which I consult routinely, you describe the old method used by Hoegaarden's breweries in the 19th century and the new method used after World War II. Could you describe the difference, the change that happened?
Well, in the old method, like I said, the grist was a fair amount of barley malt. It was a very complicated mashing. There were actually three different mashes. One of them was a turbid mash. And then those worts went into a cool ship and sat for quite a while. So they were inoculated, and then they were put into barrels. No yeast was added to those. It was all spontaneous fermentation. Occasionally, if fermentation didn't take off, they might have added some yeast to get that going. And they were relatively low gravity beers and not very well attenuated at all. And they were sour. In the new method, then you see more like the grist we expect now, 40% of a malted barley, uh, 40 some percent of unmalted wheat, and a certain amount of oats. Um, and a lot of times by then they were putting them into metal. So although they still go in a coolship, they would pitch yeast so you had a cleaner beer. Although until the 1960s, they generally continue to have a certain amount of lacto in them.
Following World War II, breweries using more sophisticated techniques were producing less rustic, more polished commercial beers. Many of the old traditional styles slowly went extinct. In Hoegaarden, the last of the traditional wit beer breweries, Thomson, closed in 1957. The knowledge of wit beer, however, had not died. One of the men who worked at Thomson started making a revival of wit beer in 1966. His name was Pierre Celis.
He grew up on his parents' farm and worked on the farm. He interned at Thompson right after the end of World War II. So that was 1945. He was 20 years old. And then he works on his parents' farm. Like others in Hoegaarden, he lamented the closing of the brewery. People would talk about it. The fact that he thought he knew the whole process, the recipe and the process. And he actually began experimenting at home. He got a wine barrel, cut it in half, um, and went through what he knew as Thompson's process and sold it to the neighbors. Initially, he had a problem because there was no fermentation. Although he had watched Thompson, he didn't realize that the barrels Thompson was using were already inoculated. So he didn't pitch yeast. That's 1945. My guess, it's only a guess, is up till 1957, Thompson was very much, his beers were very much like the old style. He used old hops, for instance. And as I said, he did not pitch any yeast. Everything was in wood, including the spoons and everything else. And the man did not own a thermometer.
Mm.
Um, so that's what Celis takes over. He's briefly in wood. He starts using metal when he can, as he can add on to his brewery. And and so then he learned about that process from I got to remember Marcel Thomas. He had worked with Thompson. He also worked at other breweries, so he brought that modern approach to it. And the Celis upgraded to where he was using fresher hops from Saaz. Like I said, a clean yeast, which apparently has some origins in wheat bread. I don't know how that spreads to the yeast that Hoegaarden uses now that Celis would have left behind. As you know, jumping in a few more things about Pierre. He wanted to be in a business other than farming.
Mm.
He is an entrepreneur. He started the brewery, which he eventually sold. Then he started another brewery in the United States, which he sold. At the time when he was still in Europe, he was acquiring caves and equipment where he could have somebody make the beer. He could cellar it. That became Groton beer. That was a beer which he riddled. So he was always thinking about these entrepreneur and thinking ahead of what would interest the market.
So one thing that we think about today when we think about wheat beer is, of course, it's a wheat beer, but we think about the spicing. We don't think of it as a wild beer, and we think about the spicing. Do you have any idea how that piece came into Chalice's recipes and developed?
Well, so he's looking about, I mean, that was used in the 19th century. The use of coriander and orange peel goes back to that. So he would have taken that directly from Thompson. And then, of course, he added his own twist because he always said he had a secret ingredient. And one thing that he brought to the United States was he was like the representative for Belgium. So we got this idea that the Belgians wouldn't tell us anything about their recipes, which is generally I found not to be true. You ask them, they told me they don't tell you everything, but they're pretty straightforward about it.
Let's trace the trajectory of how wit beer becomes an American beer style. What did Chalice do to build that you mentioned he's brewing in his barn. How does that beer come to America?
Well, first of all, like any brewery, it takes them a while to get going. 8 years in the process, 1974, he's still only making 1,000 hectoliters, which is about 850 barrels.
Mhm.
Um, by 79, he finally moves to Declares. I forget exactly how you put it, Decluse, and begins to grow. Shortly after that, in the 80s, he actually shipped beer to Austin, Texas. That's a connection. There was Michael Tassin was an importer who he's Belgian, and he knew Pierre. He was located in Austin. He brought Chimay to the United States, as a matter of fact. So he visited Texas. He shipped a little beer to Texas. So perhaps he had that in the back of his mind. As he continues to expand, he certainly takes on investors. And about 85, 86, major investor sells his interest to Interbrew. A few years later, by 87, Pierre sells his interest to Interbrew, and he's out of the business there. He comes to Austin in 90 and begins his project. In 92, he is selling Cellus White and Cellus Grand Cru, which was, I think, a triple and a double. So he is selling those styles in the United States and shipping them. He would ship things afar. I would have to look at that other history. He shipped his beer to all kinds of places. He sells half interest to Miller in 1995. You would think that makes Cellus White more prominent, but it didn't, because Miller appreciated you need to establish yourself in your home market, and they begin to withdraw. Strategy didn't work real well. As you know, that's where we have a downturn in not exactly growth stops in craft beer sales through the late 90s. And Miller gives up on the project, and they end up selling the brewery as well and closing it in 2000.
As it evolved in both Belgium and the US, wit beer was often made as a sweeter, approachable beer for a broad audience. Not everyone liked this. You quote Joris Patton saying, quote, "If anything can be said, it's that it's lost complexity over the years, constantly." Can you discuss this trend?
But in his case, which he pointed out, he was not a fan of coriander. And other, actually, when I was working on Brew Like a Monk, when I would talk to just brewers in general, they absolutely hated the overuse of coriander. It adds a sweetness. And some people are sensitive to coriander in different ways. Some people get um, basically hot dog water. I get a lot of celery. So overdone, and it can add a certain amount of sweetness to it. And then his thought was that it had lost the sharpness that it gets from the orange peel. It was also not as well attenuated. And if you look across, again, talking about it different, the strong golden, like Duvel, is super well attenuated. It finishes like 1.5 p.
Okay.
The rest of those beers in Belgium are much sweeter and much thicker beers, and people like them. So some of that is a matter of attenuation. And you can look at even the small shifts, like, so Hoegaarden in 2010, when I wrote the book, was attenuated, was less attenuated than Cellus White, for instance, as it was made at Steenbergen at the time, using Pierre's yeast and under Pierre's direction. So it was a little less attenuated. It was also pasteurized, and it was not bottle conditioned. And a hallmark of these beers, any Belgian beer to me, is that it is the re-fermentation in the bottle, which took place in the Cellus White, which takes place, of course, in Allagash White, does not take place in Blue Moon White.
In 1995, wit beer got a big boost in the United States. That year in Colorado, Keith Villa launched Blue Moon as a separate label for Coors. In Maine, Rob Tod launched Allagash. But Celis was a fairly small brewery in Texas, and wit beer was a very obscure style. How did Rob even learn about this beer?
I went to college in Vermont. I had a geology degree. When I got out of college, I had no idea at all what I wanted to do. I ended up out west in Colorado, spent a year working construction. I like working with my hands. And then I spent another year working back of the house restaurant jobs. When I say back of the house, I mean washing dishes. So, I just, again, I like to keep busy. So, that job suited me. And then I kind of really wanted to get back to New England. I'd grown up in New England. I went to school in Vermont. So, I still had some friends in Vermont. I ended up back there. Literally, the first job I could get was washing kegs in a brewery, Otter Creek Brewing in Middlebury, Vermont. And I had that job lined up literally within 2 hours of arriving back in Vermont. And long story short, I fell in love with everything I saw. I knew nothing about beer when I walked in the door of that brewery at all. I didn't know what hops were. I knew it was some kind of a plant. I didn't know malt was actually from barley. Yeast was just this like powder that I mixed with dough to make pizza dough rise. I didn't know it was a living organism. So, I mean, I didn't know anything about it, but within 2 days of working at Otter Creek, I literally went from knowing nothing about beer and knowing nothing about what I wanted to do in my life to knowing this is what I was going to do for the rest of my life. I was going to make beer. So I worked 1 year at Otter Creek before coming over here to Portland, Maine to start Allagash. But one of the things we did at Otter Creek, um, when any of us, and there weren't many of us, when I started, I think Lawrence had like 3 or 4 employees. When any of us saw a new beer pop up on a shelf in Vermont, or we were traveling to another state or even out of the country, we'd bring beer back. And when 15 or so beers had accumulated in the fridge, we'd stay after work on a Friday and we'd try the beers. We'd pass each of the beers around and try them and talk about them. And that's kind of when a lot of beers, it was 93, and it was when a lot of beers were just kind of being discovered. And imports were coming into the country, new craft breweries were just kind of starting. And it was fascinating to me because I really didn't know. Not only did I know anything about brewing beer, all I'd really had, with a couple exceptions, all I'd really had is like Pilsner Club, Meister Brau, Milwaukee's Best, and I mean, and I'm not knocking those beers at all, but I'm just saying it was all from a very, very, very narrow style range, obviously. And so it was just fascinating to me to see like everything beer could be. And I was particularly fascinated by Belgian beer because Belgium is a pretty small country from a geographical perspective, but there was this unbelievable variety of beer styles. So I was fascinated by the brewing tradition, um, and just the opportunities that it could give a brewer, just because of the diversity of styles. And on my way home from work one day, I saw a 6 pack of Allagash White on the shelf. I'd never seen it, I'd never heard of it. So I got it, and I was going to bring a bottle in the next day to the brewery and put it in the fridge. And I got home, and I had rented a house with a college buddy of mine who was back in town. And I stuck one bottle in the fridge to bring in the brewery tomorrow and cracked another bottle and took a sip of it. And I was like, what the, like, I've never had anything like this before. And, in a lot of ways, there were some flavors in there that are like considered problems with some beer styles. And so I said to my buddy, I was like, his name's Clymer. I was like, Clymer, I don't really like this. There's something up with this beer. And he tried it. He's like, oh, I kind of like it. I said, well, give me that bottle back. And I tried it and I finished that first bottle. And I was like, huh, this is interesting to me. Like, it's a refreshing beer. There's a lot going on with it. I've never tasted anything like this. I've never had anything that looks like this. So I tried another one and it was growing on me. 3 beers into it, it was like a revelation. I was like, wow, like this is amazing. This is amazing. And so I fell in love with the style just like that. And um, really that day and that experience stuck with me. I tried a few more white beers while I was working there, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in a little bit starting Allagash, but I mean, that's how I at least first discovered discovered a love for that style of beer.
In 1995, there weren't very many examples of wheat beer out there. Why did you decide to devote yourself to this style, and how did you learn how to make it?
My plan after working for Otter Creek was to come over here to Maine and start this brewery on a shoestring budget. And one of the things that meant is I didn't have the resources to go out and get like a company that was going to come in and write recipes and install the equipment and design it. The plan was to go out and buy a bunch of old dairy tanks and do a lot of the work myself. So, I mean, I knew I was going to be cutting the drainage trenches in the floor, doing a lot of the welding, plumbing, rigging, painting the walls, building an office space, all of that stuff. And I kept thinking to myself, what's the point of me going to all this work, building this brewery, and then hopefully, if things worked out, running it for the rest of my life, only to make something people could already get. So I really wanted um, uh, I really wanted to introduce a new experience for people, like deliver a unique experience with beer that they couldn't get elsewhere. So the white beer style, you asked, there weren't many people brewing it. So that was one of the things that drew me to it. It was difficult to get that style of beer at the time. Um, and even the few that you could get, of course, there's differences between them. And so I really looked at it as an opportunity to deliver a unique drinking experience for people who are trying the beer. And the other thing that really drew me to it was the fact that there's so much going on with the beer, flavor wise, aroma wise, like mouthfeel wise, looks wise. Um, but yet it's so like approachable and refreshing. It's obviously different. So from that perspective, the approachability can like be a little bit of a challenge because back then it was so much different. But really, when you look at this beer, I mean, I'm drinking one right now. This is about as sessionable as beer gets. Um, but there's so much complexity and there's so much going on with it. So that was one of the reasons why I ended up just doing white beer because it was unique. And um, uh, if I had to choose one single beer to start with, I wanted it to be something like a unique kind of new drinking experience. I wanted to do something in the white beer style, but I wanted it to be like unique to Allagash. So, one of the things that, and if you looked out the window here, you'd see, there's snow on the ground. It's a refreshing style of beer, and it's a great summer beer, but I wanted just to give it a little more body and character, so it kind of held up through a New England winter.
Wheat beer was quite an obscure style in 1995. Why did you choose to focus on it?
So one of the things that actually, in a weird way, and this doesn't make much sense from a business sense, but one of the reasons uh, one of the things that really drew me to making this beer and figuring it out was that there was hardly any support out there for making this style of beer. There are plenty of other styles that we could have dove into. And if we had any kind of problem, there would be, at least dozens of people I could call for support. With a Belgian style wit beer, there was nothing. There's very, very few resources. So I kind of welcomed the challenge of like kind of like almost like exploring a new beer frontier. And whenever we ran into an issue, um, we had to figure it out basically, kind of, or in at the beginning, it was just me, but I had to kind of figure it out on my own. And so you asked me what I learned, like we learned plenty. And I think this is one of the reasons you don't see a lot of Belgian wheat beers out there. It's a tough beer to brew. It's like a challenging beer to brew. Like the yeast is kind of feisty. It's particular in terms of like how much oxygen should it ideally have? What are the pitching rates? What is the temperature curve for fermentation look like? How much do you put in the package for re-fermentation? It's tricky from a spice perspective. Balance and complexity is really, really important to me as a brewer, and really important to us with all our beers. That's one of the things that makes beer so interesting. And hitting that balance, it's tricky in a wheat beer because there's a lot going on. You've got some interesting grains like unmalted wheat and malted wheat, spices, the Belgian yeast strain. So striking a balance between all those things, you're just constantly learning. And the beer itself is like so delicate in so many respects that you're just constantly learning because, maybe things are kind of stable and just as you expect, and then maybe um, the malt analysis is like slightly different and it has an effect. And so you have to figure out like what's the root cause of that change. And you're just constantly running into those challenges with making a wheat beer. And then of course, over the years, we're brewing with an agricultural product. It's maybe not changing year to year as drastically as the raw materials for a winemaker. But still, like over the years, like the size of the coriander seeds might change. Like there's going to be, fluctuations in your incoming cereal grains. Yeah, as you grow, equipment changes and you have to make accommodations in the recipe so the beer stays the same, so the drinking experience isn't affected. So there's a lot of considerations and there's constant learning. And honestly, like we're still learning and we're never satisfied like ever. And
Right.
that's what makes it fun. So even though, I mean, it's still over 80% of our production, it's 85% of our production. And, we come in Monday morning, we make Allagash White till Wednesday, and we brew a few other beers, and then we're, finished for the week. But just that continued like drive to get things as close to perfect and perfectly consistent as possible, it makes something like exciting and intriguing, even though we've been doing it for 30 years.
Let's talk a little bit about the that ingredient balance that you just mentioned
Mhm.
and the different challenges there. Wheat beers have kind of three important components. They have the flavor and the fluffy mouthfeel that comes from the wheat. They have the fermentation profile, and then they have the spices. And
Mhm.
different breweries treat this differently. You have thinner versions, you have sweeter versions, you have very spiced and not very spiced versions.
Mhm.
Can you talk about Allagash White and how you came to those decisions about where you wanted those levels to be individually and how they all work together?
I don't want Allagash White to be about coriander or even to be about spices. I don't want Allagash White to just be about wheat. I don't want it to just be about a haze, I don't want it just to be about an orangey character, just about the yeast. I want all those like flavors like playing with each other in concert. And to the point where uh, maybe if you're drinking it in different settings, you're almost having different experiences with the beer. So I'm drinking it out of a bottle right now at my desk. It's one of the nice things about being in the beer business, right? I can be working, drinking a bottle of beer at my desk. But I can have one experience with it here. I can have another experience, say I go out to dinner tonight and I'm having it with like apple pie. I'm having one experience with it. I might be at the beach and I'm getting other components of it. I could be sitting at home drinking out of a glass, getting a another character out of it. So that's what it's all about for me is like uh almost like constantly leaving you guessing keeps it interesting. Like what is that flavor? Like what is that spice or what is that grain flavor? It just keeps it interesting. And it doesn't happen as much anymore, but I'm sometimes just like discovering new flavors and experiences in this beer just because of the complexity. It's still an interesting thing for me to drink.
So one thing that Belgian brewers and Pierre himself mentioned was that sometimes they do something they don't reveal. It might be with process, it might be with ingredients.
Yeah, always
And
got to have some secrets,
you
right?
got to have some secrets. So there's some rumor out there that Allagash has a secret ingredient. So the first thing I have to ask is that true? And are you going to reveal it to us right here on this debut podcast?
It's true, but I don't have enough beers in me to spill the beans.
Okay.
I think there's been a couple times where I have spilled the beans, but it's usually after I've had a lot of beers.
I see I've made a mistake here. We should have gotten you drinking for an hour before we started talking.
Yeah, so it's spiced with coriander and orange peel, but there's also a secret spice in there. It's rare that someone guesses it, actually. And that actually makes me really happy. And it's not that they're not like expert beer tasters or very perceptive with flavors. It just tells me that it's in there at the right quantity. And honestly, it's kind of rare for me to pick it up, but I do pick it up. Sometimes I'll be in a setting, I'll be like, that's it. It's definitely there. Um, so that's something we keep pretty close to the vest. Um, and then the origin of the yeast, but it's a Belgian origin. It's actually, we're doing a little more research into it, and it seems like it actually is of Scottish origin and made its way over to southern Belgium and then up to the wheat beer brewing region. Um, but yeah, just the origin of it, but the funny thing is it's in the bottle. So it's re-fermented with that same yeast strain.
Right.
Uh,
So I think what you just described is something that I think of as peculiarly Belgian, which is um, the subtlety with the use of spices, and it's something Americans have, I think, really struggled with in my experience. When they make spiced beers, they tend to really dominate the flavor profile. And Belgians also use this really expressive yeasts, which create spicy and herbal flavors.
for sure.
Can you talk about finding that yeast strain and finding that balance and how the two of those two components play off each other in your beer?
Yeah, I mean, I experimented with a few different yeast strains as I was building the brewery. I had a little 10-gallon system and I just ran pilot batches with different yeast strains. And I mean, honestly, the one I landed on, it was just kind of personal preference for flavor profile. I was like, I like that one's really like, resonating with me and working with the spices and kind of the flavor profile I'm looking for, and ended up going down that route, honestly, without a whole lot of, um, it wasn't like I experimented with it for an entire year and experimented with on a large scale. This was on a pretty small, like rudimentary system. But I liked the flavor, and it was relatively easy to work with. Turns out it wasn't as easy to work with as I thought. When I ended up getting up and running and brewing, we learned a lot of lessons with it. Um, but uh, it was seemed easy enough. It was like repitching pretty well. It was like flocking out after the fermentations pretty well, and staying nice and cloudy. So I mean that's kind of it. I experimented, I think, with like three or four different strains, and really like was drawn to this one.
A key part of Belgian beer culture is the way it is designed to complement food. When you walk into a cafe and order a Belgian ale, they bring it out and decant it for you at the table. It's a very intentional way of serving a beer, and the flavor components are very intentionally composed to interact with each other. That has been one of Allagash White's greatest assets since it debuted.
Yeah, I mean that was something that very early on for me struck me as a way to like explain this beer and talk about this beer. There are a few places that put it on, and it actually did okay. Definitely not a top seller, but it kind of paid its rent. You know what I mean? But uh, the pairing, just the concept of pairing it with food, and you're 100% right about the Belgian culture. You know, if I walk into a cafe and order an Orval and they don't have Orval glasses, they kind of come back and they're like, "We're so sorry. We don't have this glass. Is it okay if we put it in this glass?" And that would be very rare to see in the US. Really anywhere else in the world. But so I started doing beer dinners really early on, and that was just a way for I think people to be able to relate to the beer. You know, I could stand up, and a course would come out, and one of our beers would come out. Allagash White was always in the mix, and I could, talk about like the flavor profile of the white, like the mouthfeel and like the texture and this the subtle spicing, and talk about how that like interacted with food. And it was a way, I think, early on for people to relate to it a little more. And it really it was part of, we weren't the only ones that were doing this, and that was part of just elevating beer. Because you go back to the 1980s, there was only one beer style available, essentially. So a lot of just like introducing what beer had to offer for this culture, um, I think involved like uh, uh, explaining it in a way that people could relate to it, and really food pairing. You can have like an in-depth, it's a one-way conversation because it's me talking to like 50 attendees, but maybe people are raising their hand. But it's a way for us to like have a conversation about like, why does beer look like this? Why does this beer taste like this? And you can talk about the attributes of the beer. It's a different way of thinking of it.
When craft brewing arrived in the United States, breweries tried their hand at beer styles from different cultures. Those styles had, in many cases, already been evolving for decades or even centuries. The wit beer Rob Tod started making in 1995 was a 29-year-old revival style, reinvented after it went extinct. Today, it's a 60-year-old style, and Rob has been making it for more than half its life. When some of the most important examples of a style are made outside its home country, it's worth taking stock. Is Allagash White a Belgian style? An American style? A Maine style? How do we think about this beer?
I think we're much more thought of as like an American beer in some respects, a very unique American beer, because no one else is really still making a beer like that's this broadly sold. I mean, we sell beer now in 23 states, so we have a pretty wide reach. Um, but we're also really thought of as a Maine beer, and there's an appeal to that. There's an appeal to Maine. And for me, one of the really cool things about this beer now is, not just how much a part of Maine it is, but how much a part of Maine is in the beer. Because I don't know if we've talked about this before, but we made a pledge back in, it was either 16 or 17, to buy 1 million pounds of Maine grown grain by the year 2021. We hit that goal. This year, we're up to almost 2 million pounds a year. And, it's just like a perfect marriage between a style and a state, because turns out the wheat that we use in this beer, it grows great in northern Maine and really potato country. So a lot of these fields, they're potato farms for a year, and then they're wheat farms for a couple of years, or wheat potato farms for 2 years, and then they'll rotate wheat in. It works perfectly. Like, it's a perfect marriage. It's something I never would have guessed in a million years. Um, that we'd be uh, producing one of our raw materials in the state, and B, that we build this beer up to basically 100,000 barrels of annual production. So actually be able to buy a meaningful amount of cereal grains in the state, both barley and but in a lot of white wheat, really making an impact in the state, making it's reducing our carbon footprint. So there's a lot of Maine in this there's a lot of Maine in this beer, in addition, like to really being thought of as a Maine beer. So that's been really one of the like gifts of this style because I'm not sure if we could have done it.
I woke up at 4:30 this morning still trying to figure it out. Um, and which wit beer are we talking about? If we're talking about what a modern wit beer, and beer becomes modern, and you maybe lose some things, complexity over time, um, and you try and figure out how to build that back in a modern world where you're going to use clean yeast, a single strain yeast. You're not going to have wild yeast in there. So how do you make that work? And certainly attenuation is part of it in that makes uh, the Allagash White more like we understand the Celis White was like. I haven't seen figures on the Celis White out of Texas. I know what they were making in Belgium, which was Pierre's approach to it. Um, and then, the understanding of trying to keep the complexity in there, which balance is super important. They don't want too much bubble gum, that ester formation, but they don't want too much clove. And these are the yeast strain. There's this house strain which comes from the others, but the Hoegaarden isn't as crazy as, say, Westmalle yeast, but it will produce those characters. So you're trying to figure out through the process where you're restraining the clove, but there's enough there where it's like pepper. And in the case of the ester formation, where you're getting those esters, maybe a little bit of banana, but not bubble gum. So it's a matter of working on balance. I first visited Allagash in 2004, when I think Rob had maybe 4 employees. I met them all. When I was working on Brewing with Wheat and visited in 2008, 4 years later, had gone through the first expansion of becoming much larger. And he wasn't involved on day-to-day brewing at all. He still did the welding. But I can remember talking to him, and this is a guy who had been drinking the beer by then for 13 years,
Right.
every batch, and could say the goal is to have it not change. And at the beginning, he admitted he wouldn't have understood the importance of how his raw materials change and the impact, how a brewery grows and your processes change. And you have to make those adjustments all the time. But when you have one person tasting your beer and saying, we don't want it to change, you can make those adjustments as long as his palate is consistent. And what I would say about Allagash White is it's brewed in the Belgian spirit, and it's also brewed in the American spirit. And there is in a Venn, I hate Venn diagrams, but in a Venn diagram, there's area where those two intersect, and that's where Allagash is. Rob is, and Jason, and now they're brewers because you're at Allagash X amount of time, you get a trip to Belgium, and I think Rob and Jason go all the time. Somebody has to chaperone them. And so they definitely have a connection to the Belgian brewers, and particularly the Belgian brewers who are making sour beers, as a matter of fact, even though their wet beer is not. And I think that rubs off. We went back to the ideas: when do you change, and how do you change, and how do you make beer better? And that's certainly taking place at some levels in the United States as well, or if you want to say America.
I mean, that's kind of the history of beer, right? Well, it's the history of everything in the world, like technologies, ideas, art, beer. These ideas bounce from culture to culture. And when an idea comes over to one culture, it's a different culture and people look at it differently and they see different opportunities with it and approaches with it. And it adapts and then maybe it bounces to another culture. And
Yeah, they do change a little bit. And so maybe Allagash White has changed a little bit because I think the focus changes because you recognize that there's um, a little edge here that distracts, and you figure out a way to remove that. Or you notice, whoops, I got this character before, maybe a little bit of spicing, and you think, how do I get that back in? So you've got this vision of the best version of this beer in your head. But in modern terms, maybe that best version of your beer starts to change more significantly because you think that's better. We're not talking about IPAs. And in this case, we're talking about IPAs. We're talking about something's new and where new raw materials give you an opportunity to make something different.
My thanks to Stan Hieronymus and Rob Tod for joining us to tell this story. This show is produced by All About Beer and was edited by John Hall. Visit us online at allaboutbeer.com, where you'll find a trove of wonderful information about beer. And please follow us on social media. I'm Jeff Allworth. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one iconic beer.